My Writing, Steven Sayfi. Chapter 1. The Pen in the Dark. The air was cold, as if autumn had clawed its way into the small town of Sarvin Hill. A thick fog blanketed the narrow streets, and the streetlights glowed faintly like the eyes of a sick man, dim and trembling. Steven Sayfi, a writer whose name once topped the New York Times bestseller list, sat at his worn desk in an old house. His pen trembled in his hand, not from the cold, but from something he couldn't explain. Steven Sayfi, or as the locals in Sarvin Hill called him, Crazy Steven, was no longer the writer whose stories set readers' hearts racing. His last novel, Silent Shadows, had been published 5 years ago, and since then, nothing. The words had fled his mind, like birds escaping a broken cage. Now only one thing kept him going: his old typewriter, a 1940 Remington, bought by his grandmother from an antique shop in Tehran. Every night, Steven sat at the typewriter, placed a blank sheet of paper in it, and waited. Waited for something he didn't understand. His fingers hovered over the rusty keys, but no words came. Tonight, though, was different. When the clock struck midnight, a sound came from the typewriter. Not the usual clack-clack, but something like a human whisper. Steven leaned closer. "Write! Write! Or we will write!" The voice drifted out from the keys like a cold breeze. Steven froze. His heart pounded, but his hand, as if guided by another will, settled on the keys and began to type. Words appeared on the paper, but they weren't his. "You think you're a writer, Steven Sayfi, but it's not your pen that writes the story. It's us, it's always been us." Steven yanked the paper out and stared at it in horror. The black ink seemed alive, rippling on the page like fresh blood. He crumpled the paper and threw it into the corner of the room, but the typewriter's whispers didn't stop. Chapter 2. Stories that write themselves. The next morning, Steven woke up exhausted and rattled. He thought it might have been a dream, but the crumpled paper still lay in the corner. When he opened it, the words had changed. "Write again tonight, or we will write you." Steven decided to destroy the typewriter. He carried it to the basement where dusty boxes and cobwebs waited. But as he raised the axe above his head, a voice behind him said, "Don't, Steven. We only want to help." He turned, but no one was there. Only a shadow, tall and shapeless, moved across the basement wall and vanished. Steven thought, "This is madness, I'm going insane." But a part of him, the part that had written horror stories for years, knew this wasn't madness. Something was real. That night he couldn't resist. He sat at the typewriter again. This time the words came faster. A story about a small town, like Sarvin Hill, where one resident disappeared every night. The story was terrifying but gripping. Steven couldn't stop reading, even when he realized the main character, a man named Steven Sayfi, was him. Chapter 3. The cost of writing days passed, and the story continued every night. Steven no longer wrote. The typewriter did. The story grew darker. Steven Sayfi, in the tale, encountered shadow-like creatures that fed on words. They promised him eternal fame, but at a price. He had to finish the story even if it cost him his life. Steven Sayfi was now trapped in both the real world and his own story. Every night he wrote, something of himself faded. It was as if his soul had merged with the typewriter's ink. The people of Sarvin Hill began to disappear, just like in the story. And every time someone vanished, Steven saw a shadow in the corner of his eye. One night, as the story reached its climax, the typewriter stopped. Steven looked at the paper in terror. The last sentence read, "Steven Sayfi put down the pen, and the shadows swallowed him." His heart raced. The whispers grew louder. Shadows slid down from the walls, creeping toward him. Steven screamed, "I'm the writer! You can't write me!" But the shadows only laughed. The next morning, Steven Sayfi's house was empty. The typewriter sat on the desk, with a single sheet of paper bearing one sentence. "The story never ends." A few months later, Steven Sayfi's new book, My Writing, appeared in bookstores. It became the best-selling book of the year, but no one knew where the author was. And everyone who read the book heard strange whispers from the corners of their rooms at night.